The one weird thing about most old maps is, well, for the most part, they were kind of useless. They showed you places, but they never showed you how to get there. If they showed rivers, they didn't show which could take a boat. If they showed roads, well, they didn't. They just didn't show roads at all. Until one publisher, desperately broke and enormously creative, created an entire atlas filled with maps like this one. It was 1675, 350 years ago, and it was a marvel. Every bit as much a game changer as when they put the first mapping app on a cell phone. I happen to have one in my collection. It happens to cover a good part of Essex, and I thought it would be fun to see just how lost I could get trying to use it. How do you suppose an American would fare in Chelmsford with a 350-year-old map to guide him? Let's find out. Welcome to the Eye of History. Maps are the lens in which we examine history in nerdy detail. Science, economics, politics, culture, wherever the maps lead us. If you are the intellectually adventurous sort, then hit that subscribe button and join the fun. If you ask the question, what was the first road map? You'll get a few different answers. In the Roman Empire, the administrators created what they called tables, written directions on how to get from place to place. And sometimes they would draw a sort of schematic representation of those routes. The most famous is the Putinger tables, a medieval copy of which survives in the Austrian National Library. It's tough, though, to call it a real map. It doesn't really try to represent either direction or distance. There's another medieval map that does try to show direction and distance. It's the Goff map. It dates to the 14th century or maybe the early 15th century. And it has these lines on it running from town to town that look like they must be roads. At least, that's what everyone thought they were before a few smart alecks started comparing the Goff map to the real world. In truth, these lines were an afterthought. They were added to the map by its owner, not to represent roads, but to represent the travel time from place to place. At least, for those few routes and places that he was interested in. The invention of printing didn't change the situation. A few 16th century maps included some specific roads, pilgrimage routes, typically. And in the early 17th century, cartographers started publishing maps with the post roads, but only the post roads. They weren't really for travelers. Their purpose was to show where the postal service operated and how long it would take for a letter to reach its destination. That the post roads could be used for other purposes was just a bonus. Somehow, European society made it all the way to 1675 without knowing how to get anywhere. Of course, I'm joking. They used verbal directions, like the way you give directions over the phone. Turn left at the intersection before you get to where the red barn used to be. But that changed with this map here. And you can't call this anything but a road map. It shows distance, it shows direction, and it definitely shows the road. It was part of an atlas that covered most of Britain, and it helped create a whole new industry, what today we call tourism. The atlas was the invention of one of the most oddball characters in the history of cartography, John Ogilby. Ogilby was a lot of things before he was a cartographer. He spent the first 55 years of his life as a publisher of classical texts, and as a poet, as a theater owner, as a dancing master. He translated Homer, poorly, and Aesop's fables, much better. He was at one point in his life posted in Ireland as both the Master of Revels and the Master of the King's Imprimeries, that is, the government printing house. It was only in the last decade of his life that he became a cartographer, and the most innovative cartographer of his time. And this map is why I can say that. There are so many innovations within it, starting with the means with which he collected the information. To make it, he sent his agents to push a big wheel, he called it a waywiser, to measure the routes, some 2,500 miles of road, and to make sketches of the key places and intersections as they went. All this data was collected and collated. The atlas is filled with lists and tables. And then he handed the results to some of the most talented engravers of his time, leading to some of the most beautiful, and useful maps you'll ever see. Here is the page for my collection. I purchased it at an auction just last year. The page actually contains 3 maps, all starting at Chelmsford, the county town of Essex. There were 100 maps in total. Each map shows just a single route laid out in a strip. Really, just like your cell phone, except for it doesn't move as you go up. But more than just the route, each map also shows direction and distance. They are true maps, just trimmed down to strips. We'll start with direction. North is not at the top. Instead, a compass rose shows the true north. In some maps, the route takes a turn, and those strips are split into sections, and each leg of the trip gets its own compass rose. We can see this split on the 3rd map on this page. Here at the village of Deal, the map takes a turn. On this section, north is to the left. On this section, north is to the bottom right. As for distance, each route is marked every mile. That's another Ogilby innovation. The maps show bridges and crossroads, generally noting where the crossing paths lead. Villages, landmarks, and even stretches of forests and hills are indicated, enough to reassure the traveler that they're on the right track. Here's a nifty windmill, which I imagine was probably the tallest feature in the general area. So let's see how this works. The first route is from Chelmsford to Maldon, which is about 10 miles to the east. Notice that Ogilby did something clever here. He puts the starting spot at the top of the map, right here, and then puts the destination right below it. The route then immediately wraps around from the top of the page to the bottom, then runs up the page to the destination. Now remember that this map was published in an atlas. By putting the start and the destination together at the edge like this, he makes it much easier to find the route when you're flipping through the pages. Ogilby really thought through every detail and had some incredibly creative ideas. Remember, he invented this entire format, and in 350 years, I'd say that no one has ever improved on it. So we start at Chelmsford. Looking at the compass rose, we see that we have to travel southeast through Great Battow. We wrap around to the bottom of the page and we see a crossroad to Little Battow, and then we go through a park at Danbury Place, up a hill to Danbury Village, and through the Danbury Common. Another crossroads. To our left will be a place called Woodham Water, another crossroad leading to Beeley Mill, and then we're in Maldon. That seems pretty easy, but of course, we can't just leave it at this. I want to see if this map would still work today. As an American, my default assumption is that it can't. Too much can change in 350 years. Like, you could gain a whole empire and then lose it, start an industrial revolution, and then deindustrialize again, and still have time left over to apologize to everyone for having created the modern world. With all that history gone by, surely the route to Chelmsford to Maldon has been ripped up a half-dozen times over so many eventful years. Let's fire up Google Maps and find out. We enter in Chelmsford and Maldon as our endpoints and let it calculate some routes for us. I have to tweak the endpoints a little bit. Chelmsford is now a city of over 100,000, a bit bigger than it was 350 years ago. So I find a spot that looks like it was near the center of the old town. There isn't a setting for horse and carriage, so I set the transport mode to walking. Google helpfully pops up with a couple alternatives, and I pick the shortest one. I figure that your average 17th century carter isn't going 1 furlong farther than he must, whereas the 21st century driver will take a slightly longer route if it avoids downtown congestion or some slow curves. We'll see if I'm right. Let's see how Google compares with Ogilby. Here's where I tweaked the endpoint. This little circle near the river looked like it might have been a town center 350 years ago, and the bridge could be the one on the map, although it obviously has been rebuilt, probably a few times over the centuries. From there, Google sends us along to the next landmark, Great Battow, and it seems like we're doing great. At the junction, Google tells us to turn left and head down Maldon Road. That name is surely a good omen. Both maps tell us that we're bypassing Sandon, but I can't find Rayleigh or Little Battle on the Google map. That said, I can't find the interchange of the A12 on Ogilby's map. The next landmark is Danbury Hill. Google tells me it's 342 feet high, but it's hard to tell in the street view. You can just tell that there is a substantial slope by looking at the building's foundations. But it's slope enough to matter to a horse-drawn cart, so it goes on Ogilby's map. We reach the junction at the center of Danbury, and it seems that Google still has us on Ogilby's route. In the next stretch, the road narrows down. It's called Old London Road here, with the emphasis on the word old. Here it's easy to imagine creaky wagons sharing the road with riding horses and shuddering carriages. Looking at the map, Woodham Walter has seen a spelling change and Beeley Mill is now just Beeley. But we're definitely on track. The road widens again as it approaches Maldon, then it takes us right into what must have been the city center. I'm sure that none of these buildings were around in Ogilby's day, but you could tell most Americans that this is Tudor England and we wouldn't know the difference but for the asphalt and the delivery vans. I'm amazed. It's impressive enough that we could trace the route. That Google would come up with this route just by asking for the best walking route is flabbergasting. Maybe I'm overstating it a bit because I'm an American and we think any 100-year-old house is worth a plaque on the stoop, but every day in Essex, thousands of people walk, bike, and drive over a 350-year-old historical artifact with hardly a thought. There's so much history hidden in plain sight. Ogilby's atlas included 2 pages of text for every page of maps, the text providing more details to help keep you on your route, plus all sorts of miscellaneous data. Historical tidbits, market days, fortifications, accommodations. It's very neatly organized. Ogilby's maps were a tremendous success, and they helped make Britain a nation of tourists. Of course people traveled before these maps were made, but for business or religion, rarely just to see the sights. But this started to change in the late 17th century. Young men of means started capping their education with a trip to Europe, what they called the Grand Tour, visiting the ruins of Pompeii, the opera halls of Naples and Vienna, the art of Rome, Florence, and Venice, the splendor of Paris. And beside the Grand Tour was a lesser sort of domestic tourism. Spas, caverns, cathedrals, and castles all seemed worth a trip, and travel books became bestsellers. This is also the time when carriages began being equipped with suspensions, making long rides so much more comfortable. Ogilby himself did not long outlive his invention, but he lived long enough to publish caustic complaints about copycats, and his own atlas was reprinted 3 more times. Ogilby is even given credit for getting the British people to use the standard mile for everything. Before Ogilby, people generally preferred to use the customary mile, especially when marking out anything that was taxed. You see, the official mile of 1,760 yards, we call it the Statute Mile because it was created by a parliamentary statute, was a lot shorter. The customary mile was 2,428 yards, which means that anything measured with a statute mile was automatically longer and thus subject to more tax. And yes, this was by design. The statute was meant to be a hidden tax rise. Ogilby's complaints about copycats were not idle whining. Ogilby had to pay a sizable staff to travel across Britain with their waywisers, as well as pay for the engraving and printing. It cost around £14,000, something like $5 million today, and despite the obvious value to the government, neither Parliament nor Crown invested a farthing. Robert Hooke, the scientist, helped Ogilby raise money, but much of the money was raised through lotteries. Buy a ticket, get a chance to win an atlas. Ogilby was, if anything, a scrapper. He needed to be. He had lost everything in the Great Fire of London in 1666, and he needed this atlas to succeed. It did. and it was a well-deserved success. Personally, I collected for a long time before I got myself one of these, and I regret not being more aggressive. For the collector, these maps have everything. They were tastefully composed and beautifully engraved, and as the first road maps, they were important to the history of cartography. And being some of the most detailed maps of the British countryside, they are valuable documents for historical research as well. And John Ogilby's eccentric biography certainly doesn't hurt their value. Personally, I consider these some of the best maps for the novice collector. Since they're so popular, they aren't hard to find, and they aren't all that expensive. I think that a couple $100 is cheap for a 350-year-old frame-worthy piece of art. And they have what I like to call curb appeal. They're fun to look at, even if you aren't a map buff. And if you ever find yourself in the British countryside, your cell phone battery dead, and you need to find the way to Chelmsford, you'll be set. If you enjoyed this little virtual adventure, hit that like button, and let me know what other cartographic adventures you'd like to see on the Eye of History.